Hey, welcome to the One Place Church YouTube channel. Do us a favor and hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell. That way you can get notifications for when videos happen. Enjoy the sermon.
Have you ever, how many of you guys like confrontation? You like to confront people? Okay. Wow. Okay. Do that again. Raise your hands. Really look around, guys. These are the people you don't want to mess with. But you ever had that, I'm not big on confrontation. I push it back as long as I can. I'm not afraid of it, but I don't like it. But have you ever wanted to confront someone, and then when you finally get that opportunity, it just didn't go as you planned for it to? Maybe that person did something wrong. Maybe they said something that ruffled your feathers, maybe offended you, or something like that. And so you leave and you go home and you're rehearsing everything in your head. Like, when I get an opportunity, I am going to say this, and then they're going to say that, and then I'm going to come back with this. And you've rehearsed it in your head and you know exactly how it's going to go. And when you finally get the opportunity, you find out that maybe you're the one that was wrong. Maybe you assumed something, and after talking with them, you realize that you misread their intentions or their motives. Maybe you took something out of context, or maybe there was more to the story than what you realized. And after talking to them, you understood more clearly. This happens a lot, I would say, with kids and grown-ups, kids and parents, specifically, mom and dad. Kids, they don't understand why their parents do some of the things they do, or why they don't allow them to do some things. And really, it's because their parents are older and wiser, right? We've been through some stuff. They know that some things just aren't good for their kids, even though it may seem insignificant or harmless to the child. Everybody else is doing it, Mom. They've seen that show. They get to go to the mall by themselves. They get to have a Facebook. All the parents are now wishing their 11 to 13-year-olds were in the room, right? They're like, they're nudging their kids. Parents, we do have some binders that you can take notes, encourage your kids to take notes. You're just kind of wishing, you're like, thank you, Jesus. Finally, you're going to speak to my child. This is all for you. And you're nudging them like, well, hold on a second. Hold on. Because the reality is, we never grow out of this. When things happen to us that maybe we don't understand, it bothers us, we demand an answer, and we sit and we stew on it, and we say, we're going to tell God this, we're going to tell that person that. This happens everywhere in our lives. It happens at home, husband and wife, parent, child. It happens at our jobs with our bosses and our coworkers. Happens in our churches, and especially happens with God. So we're in this series called When Life Hurts, and we're learning how to deal with suffering through the life of Job. Job, you can see, is suffering. He's lost everything, and he doesn't know why. He's done everything right that he can think of before God, and he can't figure out why God is allowing this suffering to happen to him. And all throughout his story, we never see him sin against God or turn his back on God, but we do see him say some pretty strong words towards God, right? We see him question God. We see him critique God. In his anguish and in his pain. Sometimes when we're in pain, when we're hurting, we say some things that we don't really realize what we're saying, right? Would you agree? Well, that's what's happening with Job. In his anguish, we read how he even accuses God of treating him unfairly. We see him accuse God of injustice towards him. We see him say that God is hiding from him and not responding to him. We see Job several times in his story demand an audience with God. He talks of his desire to take God to court. Job asked to speak to God directly so he can argue his case with God. So he's constantly asking, God, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you. Why are you hiding? Why aren't you responding? Well, in chapters 38 through 41, Job finally gets what he's wanted. In these chapters, God responds to Job, but it doesn't really go as Job planned. For the next 4 chapters, we read. Are you guys reading along with me? Yes. Who's reading the book of Job? Yes, awesome. The other guys, glad you're at church today, you know. But for the next 4 chapters, God responds. But instead of answering Job's questions of why, he turns the tables on Job and peppers him with all these questions of his own. So I want to take a look of some of these things, God's response. And so if you have not been reading with us the book of Job, we're going to read chapter 38 together so you can cross that off your list, right? We're going to read all that together, and then we'll kind of talk about it. But chapter 38, starting in verse 2, God responds, and he says, "Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words?" You can probably assume that Job is like, uh-oh. "Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, buddy." He didn't say buddy, I did, because it just sounds more dramatic. "And you must answer them." And then he goes in, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Bless you. "Tell me, if you know so much, who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone? As the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Who kept the sea inside its boundaries, as it burst from the womb and wrapped it, and as it clothed it with clouds and wrapped it in thick darkness? For I locked it behind barred gates, limiting its shores. I said, this far and no farther will you come. Here your proud waves must stop. Have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Have you made daylight spread to the ends of the earth to bring an end to the night's wickedness? As the light approaches, the earth takes shape like clay pressed beneath a sill. It is robed in brilliant colors. The light disturbs the wicked and stops the arm that is raised in violence. Have you ever explored the springs from which the seas come? Have you explored their depths? Do you know where the gates of death are located? Have you seen the gates of utter gloom? Do you realize the extent of the earth? Tell me about it if you know. God's got some sarcasm in here. Where does light come from and where does darkness go? Can you take each to its home? Do you know how to get there? But of course you know all this. For you were born before it was all created, and you are so very well experienced. I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm talking to my child. Have you visited the storehouses of the snow or seen the storehouses of hail? I have reserved them as weapons for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war. Where is the path to the source of the light? Where is the home of the east wind? Who created a channel for the torrents of rain? Who laid out the path for the lightning? Who makes the rain fall on barren land in a desert where no one lives? Who sends rain to satisfy the parched ground and make tender grass spring up? Does the rain have a father? Who gives birth to the dew? Who is the mother of the ice? Who gives birth to the frost from the heavens? For the water turns to ice as hard as rock, and the surface of the water freezes. Can you direct the movement of the stars, binding the clusters of the Pleiades, or loosening the cords of Orion? Can you direct the constellations through the seasons, or guide the bear with her cubs across the heavens? Do you know the laws of the universe? Can you use them to regulate earth? Can you shout to the clouds and make it rain? Can you make lightning appear and cause it to strike as you direct? Who gives intuition to the heart and instinct to the mind? Who was wise enough to count all the clouds? Who can tilt the water jars of heaven when the parched ground is dry and the soil has hardened into clods? Can you stalk prey for a lioness and satisfy the young lion's appetites as they lie in their dens or crouch in the thicket? Who provides food for the ravens when their young cry out to God and wonder about in hunger? God is trying to prove something to Job. I have to catch my breath for a second. He goes on. This is something that God does for 4 chapters. In chapter 39, God talks about his knowledge and control over animals. Okay, this just seems so random. He asks Job things like, do you know when the wild goats give birth? He goes, who gives the wild donkey its freedom? I have placed it in the wilderness. Its home is the wasteland. In verse 13 through 18, he talks about an ostrich and how he has deprived her of wisdom. Verse 19, God asked, have you given the horse its strength or clothed its neck with a flowing mane? Verse 26, is it your wisdom that makes the hawk soar and spread its wings towards the south? He continues in Job 40 to God speaking of his strength. Verse 8 and 9, God says, will you discredit my justice and condemn me just to prove you're right? Are you as strong as God? Can you thunder with a voice like this? Chapters 40 and 41, God talks about 2 beasts that man cannot control or outpower. Verses 15 through 19, he says, take a look at Behemoth, which I made just as I made you. It eats grass like an ox. See its powerful loins and the muscles of its belly. Its tail is as strong as a cedar. The sinews of its thighs are knit tightly together. Its bones are tubes of bronze. Its limbs are bars of iron. It is a prime example of God's handiwork, and only its creator can threaten it. He also speaks of Leviathan. Verse 33, God says, nothing on earth is its equal. No other creature so fearless. Of all the creatures, it is the proudest. It is the king of beasts. Verses 7 through 11, he says again, speaking of Leviathan, will its hide be hurt by spears or its head by a harpoon? If you lay a hand on it, you will certainly remember the battle that follows. You won't try that again. No, it is useless to try and capture it. The hunter who attempts it will be knocked down. And since no one dares to disturb it, who then can stand up to me? Who has given me anything that I need to pay back? Everything under heaven is mine. Why is God doing this? He's talking about everything else other than what Job wants to talk about. Other than what we want him to talk about. Job wants to know why God has allowed this suffering to occur. But instead of God talking to Job about why suffering, God instead is asking Job all these questions that he knows Job doesn't have the answer to. And the first reason I think that God is doing it this way is I think it's simply because Job prayed for an audience with God. And God is simply just honoring his request. All throughout Job's suffering, he doesn't stop seeking God. He's constantly asking, God, where are you? Have you abandoned me? I want an audience with you. Come talk to me. He continues to take his cares before God in hopes that God will answer. And God answers because that's who he is. He's not just a God that sits on a throne in heaven being entertained by all this drama that is happening on earth. He's a personal God that wants to be personal with you. And when we continually call on him, it moves him to respond. Jeremiah 29:13 says, if you look for me wholeheartedly, you will find me. And I can look at the story of Job and watch him as he talks to his friends, but then turns and also talks to God. Job is searching God with all of his heart. This is the first book of the Bible, so it almost seems like God is honoring his word. Jeremiah was written after Job, and God is being who he is right then. Do you understand? He's always been this way, and he always will be. Jesus said in Matthew 7 and 8, he says, keep on asking, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. Everyone who seeks finds. And everyone who knocks, the door will be open. Job had wondered if God had abandoned him, or if God was mad at him, or if God was listening. And God's response to Job proves that, yes, he is in fact listening. He hasn't abandoned him. He's there. And I would assume that maybe he didn't get the answer that he was looking for, but I would assume that it brought some sense of peace to Job in knowing that God was there and God was speaking. This story tells us that even when we don't feel him and we wonder, God is still present. He's watching. He's active. And he will respond. He's faithful to answer. He's going to be found by those who will seek him. So if you're crying out to God, if you find yourself in that season, Job's story teaches us that you should expect an answer. You should expect God to answer. But expect God to give you the answer that you need, not necessarily the answer that you want. You see, all of God's questions that he asked in 38, 39, 40, and 41, all of those questions pointed to himself. Job couldn't do these things. He didn't have the capacity for that, but God did. That's the point God was trying to make. So you can only assume by reading this story that God believes Job needs to know him more than he needs to know why. He says to Job in 38 verse 2, he says, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? It's almost as if God is saying, who do you think you're talking to? How many times have you said that to your kids this week? Sometimes God needs to ask us, who do you think you're talking to? Job seems to have this limited view of God, maybe even a small view of God, maybe thinking that God is just simply above him and he can kind of help God figure things out. And God is having to correct Job's thinking here. So God asked these rhetorical questions to Job simply to point out the distance between Job and himself. All of these things Job can't answer, but God can. He was there when all of these things were created because he created them and therefore has the power and authority over it all. He's the artist. He's the architect. He makes everything fit and work together. Job, be careful who you're talking to. Be careful with your words. God needs to point out to Job that he is in fact a big and powerful God. He is a wise God, and he knows what he's doing. God is pointing out to Job that your wisdom, your understanding, your control over things are limited, but mine is not. God is having to put Job back in his proper place. You see, because in the relationship between God and man, it's God who sets the parameters of the relationship, not the other way around. And Job had to figure that out. God will answer in his timing, right? And God's purpose in his response was not to humiliate Job, but simply to humble him, to realign him into right understanding of who God is. Job needs to understand that God is God and he is not. And when we speak to God, we must do so in a holy and reverent fear of who he is. We need to approach him with respect and honor. We need to be in awe of our mighty God. You ever worked with someone that maybe you had a boss that you became close friends with? Sometimes the lines of respect can be blurred in those instances. We can treat them like a friend during times they need to be treated like a boss. Job was quickly going down this path with God, and he needed to be reminded of God's place and his place. I know that God is our friend, and I'm thankful that God is our friend, but he is still God. He may be our friend, but that doesn't put him on the same level as we are. He's wiser and more powerful than we can ever even comprehend. Our minds cannot understand the power and wisdom of God. Isaiah 55:8-9 says, God says, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, and my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. Like we can't even comprehend, like it's not there. It doesn't exist for us to even think about. Your wildest imagination doesn't even scratch the surface to who God is. For just as the heavens are higher than earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. We can't think like God. We can't figure things out for God, right? We don't have the capacity. We can't act like God. We can't tell God how to do his job. We don't have the strength or the wisdom to. We're not always going to understand why. And that's okay if we can humble ourselves under the who. When things are going wrong, when we feel like God is being unjust, we tend to focus on the why, right? Why this, why that? Our prayer life is all about why, God, I need your help. I need this, I need that. Job is laser focused on the question of why. His friends are laser focused on the why question, and God, in his response, is saying to Job that you need to focus on the who more than the why. We think that if we get an answer to the why, then we'll finally have resolution. But that resolution only is good until the next why. And then we're in the same boat again. Why'd you do this, God? We spend all our time in prayer asking God why and trying to figure it out instead of recognizing in our prayer time, spending time in worship and recognizing who he is, speaking on the faithfulness and the goodness and the power and the might of God. God knows that the real question we need an answer to is not the why, but the who. Because it's the who that fits all things together. We're limited, but God is not. That's why all the questions point to who and not to why. What we don't understand, God does. What we can't control, God can. What we can't put back together, God has a way of figuring it out and bringing it back together better than we could hope or think or imagine. So we can torture ourselves with all the whys, or we can put our focus and energy on the who. Who is God? Why is that important? Why do we need to focus and know and learn the who? Because God is really the only one with the power, wisdom, and authority to do something about our suffering, to do something with our suffering, to take that mess, to take that brokenness, and to create a masterpiece. We're not going to figure out why. We may not ever know, but God can do that. He's our only hope. He's the only one who can bring peace in the midst of suffering. The same God that made the heavens and the earth, that set the stars and the planets and the sun and the moon in their place, the same God that limits the ocean and has the power and authority over everything on this earth, is the same God that is present in our suffering right now and can actually bring purpose from it. He can work it out for our good, but he also does it for his glory. God can and will somehow, some way, work it all out for us. We may not know why or how things fit together, but we can know who. He's the missing piece. He's that puzzle that's that missing piece that's missing in our lives. He's the only one that can make everything work out and fit together when no one else can figure out how or why. God is inviting Job, just trust me. Look at who I am. I've done all this. Don't you think I can do something with your life too? He invites us to know him, to trust him. As Christians, as Christ followers, it's okay to ask why. We can ask why, but we need to know, and we should know the who. We know God. We know his word. We need to know that he is ultimately good. We know this because of how he has revealed himself to us in the past. If we just put our focus on him, we know this because we have seen his faithfulness in our lives, in the lives of our friends and our loved ones. We've heard the stories of how God has come through. If we put our focus on him, we know this because of what we've seen and heard throughout all the history of the world and in his word. This is how God invites us to trust him, by reminding us of who he is. See what I've done. I can do this for you. Focus on me. Don't focus on the why. All of these things point to God's faithfulness and goodness and gives us something else to focus on when we don't know why, and gives us hope that God will bring purpose from this pain. You can ask why. It's okay to ask why. But make sure you put your focus on the who. You guys with me? In 1 Samuel 30, we see David and his men, his mighty men, come home from battle. And they find their homes destroyed by their enemies. Their enemies attacked while they were away. Homes were burned to the ground, and their wives and children were taken as prisoners. God had anointed David as a child to be king of Israel. And it just seems like ever since that time, David has been faced with nothing but trouble. He was constantly on the run for fear of his life, always seemed to be in danger. So David is at this place. His men are ready to stone him to death because they're just tired of running. They're tired of danger. David could have sat there in the ashes of his home, given up and just said, "Why, God?" But instead, in verse 6, it says, David encouraged himself in the Lord. He strengthened his resolve in the Lord. How did he do that? By reminding himself of God's word, God's promises to him, God's faithfulness to him, that all these years, even though he's been on the run, God has protected him and made a way of escape. God has a plan for David. And so he reminds himself of God's word and God's faithfulness and power in his life. Sometimes we're going to have to replace our whys with the word of God. We can ask why, but we need to remember and acknowledge God's goodness. We're going to have to proclaim the goodness and the faithfulness of God and the truth of his word. You can ask why, but your focus needs to be on the who. Cassie, you can come on up. We know God made the world, and we know that he knows what he's doing. The world it may seem like it's in chaos, but it's not. God's got everything under control. The oceans aren't coming at us, right? Everything is under control. God, we know that. He's made things, and he knows what he's doing. He keeps everything in order by his wisdom, power, and authority. Don't you think if he can handle the universe and all creation, then shouldn't we believe that he can handle our lives as well? On the screen, go ahead and put that thing up. On the screen here, you'll see Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity. Now, I can look at this. I see it, but I have no clue what that means, right? He can try to teach it to me, and I may grasp small pieces of it, but I have no clue what's going on in that man's brain. But you show this to a physicist, and they know what he's talking about, right? My knowledge is limited on what I can comprehend here. But to a physicist, they know exactly. They understand. I heard this story where someone asked Albert Einstein's second wife, Elsa, if she understood her husband's theory of relativity. And her response I thought was interesting. She said, no, but I know Albert, and I know he can be trusted. Hasn't God proven that he can be trusted? Maybe you're here and you're saying, no, he hasn't. And I would like to respectfully say that that's not God's problem, that's yours. Because maybe it's just maybe that you haven't given God room and a place for him to show himself worthy and faithful and true to you. We haven't given him the opportunity. The author in Ecclesiastes, King Solomon, known as the wisest man that ever lived, he wrote this in Ecclesiastes 8:17. He says, I realized that no one can discover everything God is doing under the sun. Not even the wisest people discover everything, no matter what they claim. Stand with me, please. There are things that are going to happen in this life that we will simply never understand. We may never get the answers to our whys on this side of eternity. We may not even get them when we get to heaven. I know we say like, oh, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God this and I'm going to ask God that. I would like to say that you're going to be so focused on God, on the who, that you can care less about the whys. That's what heaven's going to be like. We may never get our answers on this side of eternity. But can we trust God even if we don't get those answers? Can we look at the history of God? Can we look of what the word says about God and what he's done in our lives or what he's done in our families' lives or our friends' lives or the stories? Can we look at his history and say, he is good. he can be trusted. If he can do all of this, then he can do something with me. The most important question that we need to answer in this life is not why, but it's who. Do you know God? At the end of the day, when we stand before God, that is all that will matter. In the midst of our suffering, that is what will either sustain us or break us. Who do you know God to be? What are you believing about God? And does it line up with who he really is? The most important question is who? Because he's the answer. He's the only answer. He's the missing piece. He's the only one that can build a good work in our lives. If you're here this morning and you wonder if God even cares about you, if God even sees you or loves you, you need to look no further than the cross. Right? John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. God saw the dilemma. God saw the brokenness. God saw the suffering. And he sent his son and said, you will not go any further. He's the answer. Jesus, the cross, his resurrection is proof that God is not detached from our suffering. He is present. He is active. 2 Corinthians 4:17 and 18, Paul encourages us, for our present troubles are small and won't last very long. Think about that. It seems big to us, but in the realm of eternity and in the realm of God's power and wisdom, it's so tiny. Yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. So we don't look at the troubles we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever. We walk by faith, not by sight. We walk by faith, not by feelings. And how can we do that? When we truly know the who, then we can trust him with all of our